Of everyone's time and get as much out of this as we can. Um, Hello to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us and welcome to a special Inspiring Women series of Inspire Talks. This series has been designed to mark International Women's Day and showcase just a handful of inspiring women who are going to tell their stories. These talks are recorded as you got the notification a little bit ago and are available to watch on our new LMS system, Greenhouse, for anyone that misses them, would like to share them, or rewatch. Today, we are joined by Antoinette Dale Henderson, who's going to talk to us about powering up your potential. Antoinette is a TEDx speaker, executive coach, and founder of the Gravitas program. Before setting up her business, she spent 16 years leading global healthcare communication campaigns. She's the author of 2 books, Power Up and Leading with Gravitas. She specializes in strategically driven, results-oriented programs that make a powerful difference to teams in the UK and internationally. I'm really excited for this talk. Before we start, there will be an option to ask questions at the end of the talk. Please write these in the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen. And now over to you, Antoinette.
Thank you so much, Melanie, and hello, international women and men. Happy International Women's Day, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here. So why are we here? Well, International Women's Day aims to call out inequality and inequity in its many, many forms. And although there's been a huge amount of progress over the past few years, especially, the playing field still is not even. And stats are emerging all the time, and it really helps to look at the evidence of where we're at. So currently, women only make up 19% of boards globally and 22% of senior management teams. And that's even in organization where there's more of an equal split further down the organizational structure. And COVID, the pandemic, really hasn't helped that. So there's been some recent research by McKinsey, which has shown that women's jobs are 1.8 more vulnerable as a result of the pandemic than men's jobs. And quite a lot of that has got to do with the caring responsibilities, the unpaid caring responsibilities, which tends to fall on women's shoulders. And I actually think it's quite appropriate today, being International Women's Day, that in the UK at least, today is the day where our children actually go back to school, which starts to take some of the burden off the parents amongst us. And I know that this is an international audience, and I know that some countries are further ahead than us and some might be further behind. But the burden of unpaid care has been a huge weight on parents' shoulders over the recent year, and has really taken gender equality back. And some research even shows up to a decade. And so there's still very tangible evidence that indicates that there is still a glass ceiling that we are battling against when it comes to gender equality. So the glass ceiling is extremely powerful. But based on my experience and my research, I like to also look at the fact that there are glass bricks that women also have in front of us. So bricks that we can see through, so we can see the potential, and bricks where people can perhaps see the potential in us, but bricks that nonetheless are holding us back. So some example of glass bricks, which might sound relevant to some of the women in this audience, are things like that classic, it's like the second pandemic of the 21st century, imposter syndrome. And if we were in a room right now and I were to ask you to raise your hand to show whether you have experienced any kind of imposter syndrome at any point, then I'm sure that most of the people in the room would be putting up their hand. So imposter syndrome is an example of a glass brick. Likewise, confidence issues. And whenever I ask people who come on my programs, what would they like to get from working with me? Then confidence tends to be the number one thing that people say. And this is men and women, by the way. So this is another really tangible glass brick that can stop women especially from putting themselves forward and fulfilling their potential. Other classic examples are things like perfectionism. And again, if I were to ask you, do you have perfectionist tendencies? And evidence does show that women tend to be more perfectionist than men. Then what that leads to is that we feel like we need to be 100% prepared and 100% ready to put ourselves forward, to speak up in a meeting, to go for a more senior position before we feel like we can do that. And there's very, very well-known research by Hewlett Packard, which shows that by contrast, men need to feel like they're 60% ready. They tick 60% of the boxes in the job description for them to apply for a particular role. And so there are some real tangible glass bricks that are in our way that compound the glass ceiling that is above us. And when I was researching Power Up, I decided to conduct some research of my own, and I asked 250 women what were the challenges that they experienced in a work environment. As you can see from this slide, lack of confidence was experienced by the many, many women. Imposter syndrome, more than 50%. Challenges around being treated equally in the workplace, accessing opportunities, having their voice heard, visibility, and the glass brick around putting yourself forward are really tangible barriers that can stop women from fulfilling themselves, their potential. And this is even exacerbated when you're in the minority group. And I know that UDG, you have a great balance of men and women, but women will still find themselves in situations where they're perhaps in the minority. And this goes with all aspects of diversity and inclusion. And when you're in the minority, it's even more challenging for you to put yourself forward and get yourself known. And so I want to give you an example of that. A couple of weeks ago, I was taking part in a course, and it was a course run out of America. Okay, so I turn up about 5 minutes early, and they're all Americans on the call, and they've all got their videos on, and they're all talking, and even me, right? I deliver training programs in impact and influence, and I work in leadership communications. I still felt this pressure of like, oh, dare I kind of switch on my video and unmute myself and start talking, because I'm clearly the other. I'm clearly the imposter in this situation. And so eh, being in the minority is another very tangible brick that can get in the way. So where does the International Women's Day theme of choose to challenge come in? Well, I think it's a particularly relevant theme right now, because there are the big things that we need to be continually challenging at an organizational level. So things like the gender pay gap, for a start, things like recruitment bias, things like unconscious factors within an organization that prevent a woman from having an equal place. So there are the big things that need to be challenged. But there are also the little things that drip by drip by drip can conspire together to prevent a woman from going beyond the need to be 100% ready before she puts herself forward. And so I know that you're in a very inclusive organization. And so I'm sure that a lot of what I'm about to talk about does not occur within the UDG group. But and it's interesting because I spent 16 years working in healthcare communications, and I know that within the UDG group that, you know, that's very much a factor of what you do as an organization, as a group. And so I spent 16 years working in healthcare comms. And during that time, I didn't, on the surface, feel like that I experienced overt sexism or overt challenges to my progression. I remember being very ambitious and feeling like I was able to progress fairly effectively. But then when I started to kind of dig below the surface, I then realized, well, actually, when I got to about account director, senior account director level, I started to look upwards and think, where have all the women gone? Where have those amazing women who I aspired to be at the start of my career, where have they gone? And many of them had got to the point where they were juggling family, and they were juggling travel, and they were juggling all the different challenges of holding down an important and senior job. And it was just becoming too hard. And I remember one particular moment where I was on a plane bound for Chicago, and we were about to launch some international data at a congress. And I remember just this real conflict of all I wanted to do, because I was a young mother, all I wanted to do was be at home and do my best for my family. And equally, that pull of doing the best for my career. And ultimately, that juggle, the amount of time traveling just ended up being too hard. And so when I started to dig below the surface and think about those little subtle drip, drip by drip factors that really stopped me from fulfilling my potential. And then I started to remember some of the patronizing comments that I may have received from key opinion leaders, or some of the difficult positions I found myself in with clients and with colleagues. Some subtly sexist remarks where you're not quite sure whether you can say something or not. You don't quite know how to call it out, but you know that ultimately you feel a bit uncomfortable. And so those subtle barriers, those subtle challenges that it's really difficult to call out are still quite prevalent in a working environment. And so, as I say, I only really started thinking about this and feeling inspired to do something about it when the gender pay gap started to be reported. And that was around about the time when the Me Too movement started to call out extreme forms of inappropriate behavior. And I started to think, well, look, at this point, my two daughters were starting to be teenagers. And I remember thinking to myself, I really don't want my daughters to be going into a working environment and to have to handle these big overt challenges, but also the subtle drip by drip challenges that can sometimes conspire to stop us from moving ahead. And so I decided to do something about it, which is where the Power Up book, the idea for the Power Up book came from. It also came around the time where, and I work with men and women, okay? So I'm really very much about equality and giving everyone, working with everyone to help everyone fulfill their potential. But I remember particularly at that time, the senior women who I was talking to saying to me, I wish I had had access to some of the techniques and thought processes and insights that you've been sharing on the course that I was running, the Gravitas course that I was running. I wish I'd had access to them. So that's why I decided to spend a year to power through writing my second book, Power Up, the Smart Woman's Guide to Unleashing Her Potential. But I want to say, and I'm going to share some of the insights from that book now, all of these insights are absolutely appropriate to men, women, whoever you are, whatever level you're at, however you identify. All of this is appropriate and relevant to everyone. And so I thought, right, because I realized that this is all about power. This is all about an imbalance of power. And this relates to all aspects of diversity and inclusion. And so I thought, right, well, I'm going to start doing some research into what power actually is. And so I started by looking at power through the ages and how power has been misused, how people have been trampled upon, and how through history people have risen up and challenged the inappropriate power that they have been on the receiving end of. Whether it's the civil rights movement or whether it's the suffragette movement, and moving on to more recent history that we can all remember around the gender pay gap and around the Me Too movement, and calling out the more recent examples of inappropriate behavior, I realized that ultimately it was where there was an imbalance of power. So I then started to think about, well, what are the studies into power? What information can we find out about how power comes across? And so I looked into all the different studies, and I actually remember in some of the leadership development programs that I have delivered, some of this data is what I would cover when we started to have a conversation about power. So the first most recent study, and it's not that recent, is it? It's like 1959 to 1965. It was French and Raven who looked at different types of power, and they identified 6 different types, from coercive, which is basically you're using force to get what you want, to reward, which is where people are compensated. So being bonused, that's an example of reward power. Referent power is where it's been earned. Legitimate power is about a hierarchy and that you legitimately have power because of the level or the title that you have. Expert power is about being the subject matter expert. And if you have that expertise, then you have the power. And then finally, informational is if you have access to information that other people don't, then you can get power from that. So those 6 forms of power felt quite limiting and quite constricting, actually. So I started to dig around and look at, well, what other studies are out there? And I identified Joseph Nye. So again, not that recent, late 1980s. He talked about, and it was more about political power. He looked at the difference between hard power, where a country exerts its force over others, by comparison to soft power, which is more about how a country can influence the powers that be to get what they want. So it's actually Joseph Nye's distinction between hard and soft power that got me thinking about, how about power today? How about if we were to completely reframe power, create a completely different power paradigm, look at it in a totally different way so that we can all find a way to be more powerful together? That's where my thinking started. And so when I had that idea of the difference between hard and soft power, I started to think about examples of different people and how they use their power in different ways. And I started to realize that from the difference between soft power, which is more about influence, it's more about emotional intelligence, it's more about charisma, and it's all more the soft powers. And those kinds of powers, emotional intelligence, are more traditionally associated, and I'm underlining traditionally, with women, versus the harder powers, which are traditionally more associated with men. So this is about directiveness, this is about assertiveness, this is about strength, this is about hard forms of communication. And you can see the different ways in which I'm communicating that, from the more soft and the more influential over here, all the way to the harder, stronger, more powerful ways of communicating over there. And I thought, well, why on earth is it that women should be associated with the softer powers and men should be associated with the harder powers? Again, there's got to be a lot more to it than that. And then I realized that actually the superpower of the 21st century that we all need to get behind and appreciate and honor and develop is the power of emotional intelligence. Because when you develop your emotional intelligence, you are then able to flex through all the different types of power that are available, from the soft, gentle, influential, emotionally intelligent end of the spectrum, all the way up to the harder, more directive and strong. So if you develop your emotional intelligence, you're able to choose and select different types of power depending on what you need in that moment. And that felt like quite a groundbreaking moment for me when I realized that that was the case. Because then I looked at organizations and I looked at which of the organizations which are most effective, which are the organizations where people are most engaged, where the results are better than others, and where people are happier than in other organizations where people stay and progress and develop, and organizations which are more inclusive. And I realized that those organizations are the ones where people have the power to think for themselves and the ability or the permission, not that it should be granted, but to be themselves. And so it felt like there was a real link between emotional intelligence and truly powerful organizations where everyone can access their own type of power. And so I thought, if that's the case, well, how can we create a model where everyone can learn how to be more powerful themselves? And so I decided to create a model because, of course, coming from a comms background when it comes to strategy and creativity, if you've got a message to communicate, if you've got something that you want to say, ultimately, you're going to want to create a model to communicate it, aren't you? You know that. And so I decided to create the Power Up model, which I'm going to share with you now. And so here's the Power Up model. In a nutshell, it's based on a star, and it's based on a six-pronged star, which breaks this new form of power, this new power paradigm into six different components. So firstly, we've got the power of intuition. So intuition is traditionally associated with women, women's intuition, female intuition, but it can be perceived as being a bit woo-woo, a bit fluffy. But if you think about the most powerful leaders, the most effective leaders, people like Steve Jobs, Oprah Winfrey, they call on and they use intuition all the time. So think about developing your power of intuition. Then there's the power of knowledge. You know the phrase, knowledge is power. And so the clearer you are on your subject matter expertise, the clearer you are on the value you bring, the more you continue to develop your USP, the more powerful within a work organization, work context, the more powerful you're going to be. Then there was the power of resilience. Now, this power is something that we have all had to call out on tremendously, all of us, individually, as an organization, at work and at home, the ability to be resilient, to bounce back, the ability to handle knocks and shocks and ongoing changes and keep going and keep progressing. Then there's the power of magnetism, and this is the power to attract. This is about visibility. And I use the analogy of a diamond when it comes to being successful in a work environment, because you could be the most incredible project manager or leader or subject matter expert at what you do. You could be the most amazing at what you do, but unless people know about it, unless people really see you sparkling and see what you bring, then you may as well be a black rock underneath the surface of the earth. And so magnetism is about how do you identify your shine, your sparkle, and how do you get that seen? How do you get that out there? The next power source is the power of relationships. It's not what you know, it's who you know. And the ability to build and forge strong networks and build relationships across your organization. You are all part of a vast organization. There is so much potential for you to build relationships broadly. And often this is one of the things that women will deprioritize, especially when they're busy. And so the power of relationships is it will pay dividends if you prioritize building your relationships. And then finally, we've got the power of assertiveness. And this is about finding your voice and finding a way of articulating your message. And this links back to the theme of International Women's Day, which is choose to challenge. So, how do you use your voice? How do you communicate assertively in those situations where you want to challenge either the big organizational blockers and challenges or the subtle drip by drip things that can sometimes stand in your way? Well, when it comes to choose to challenge, it's firstly decide what you're challenging. So use the power of choice because we all have the potential to choose our reaction in any situation. So you could choose to be fighting every single battle, or you could prioritize what you're going to challenge and what you're going to leave to other people to challenge. So think about what you're choosing to challenge and what you're choosing to not do so. And then think about when you want to challenge. And so if someone does something or says something that you think is inappropriate or you want to challenge it, you can pick it up in the moment, you can address it there and then. Or if you feel like, at an emotional level, you might flip your lid and say something that you regret later, then you can always choose to challenge after a period of time has passed. So you can choose what you challenge and you can choose when you challenge. And then finally, you can choose how you challenge. And when it comes to how, of course, there's a whole range of different ways in which you can challenge. And I would encourage you to get used to accessing the different types of emotion or the different types of power, whether it's influential or whether it's more directive, whether it's strong, or whether there's a softness about it, and become adept at the whole range of different ways of communicating so that you can choose the way you challenge so that it's appropriate to the situation that you're in. And so you might choose to call out something in the moment. So, for example, if someone says something, you might reflect back the word that they've just used and just subtly do it to bring them up and help them appreciate what they've just done. Or you might choose to, and I really value the work by Kim Scott, and she talks about radical candor. And this is about how you care personally, but you challenge directly. And so challenging directly is about using the evidence, using the information, being really specific and precise about what you're challenging. But what I'd like to add on to that is to be really specific about the behavior that you'd like to see instead. And so we're going to draw this round to a close to summarize International Women's Day. Such a powerful day, but I'd love to take us to a point in the future where we don't need an International Women's Day to call out inequalities, to challenge inappropriate behavior, but we are having International Women's Day to celebrate the amazingness of all the women who we are, all the women who we know, and all the people who are working together within our lives and within our organizations. And so choose to challenge. It's about how do you access and marshal your power. And power ultimately is your emotional intelligence and having access to the whole range of different emotions at your disposal and learning how to channel them so that you communicate what you want, that you ask what you want, and you make sure that you get it. I'm going to hand back to Chris and we're going to move on to the Q&A session.
Thank you, Antoinette. That was really interesting and absolutely celebrating the wonderful women that are in our organisation and across the world. So yeah, we've had a few questions come in, but just as a reminder, if anyone does have any further questions, please do pop them into the Q&A box and we'll do our best to get through as many as we can. If we don't get a chance to answer them all, then hopefully we'll be able to reach out to you separately from this talk. Now, one of the first questions that came through, Antoinette, and it was one of the first things that you mentioned was, what is imposter syndrome?
Great question. And imposter syndrome is it's a word that's been used a lot, particularly over the last year or so. I hear it so much, and it's women mainly who'll say, I have imposter syndrome. Essentially, what it is that, you know, that situation where you feel like at any moment someone's going to tap you on the shoulder and say, excuse me, you don't actually belong here, you know, you don't deserve the job that you're doing. Someone's going to find you out and call you out as the imposter that you are. And it can be quite crippling in terms of stopping people from speaking their truth, from pushing themselves forward, and so they shut themselves in. But I like to think about imposter syndrome in a completely different way. And so for me, imposter syndrome is actually your evidence that you're pushing yourself out of your comfort zone, that you're trying something different. And of course, you're going to feel slightly uncomfortable and unfamiliar because it'll be something that's new. But the thing is that it shows that you're pushing yourself forward and you're pushing yourself and you're progressing. And so what you have to do is to stay there, not retreat back, not to feel like that imposter syndrome is your message that you need to stop, but to get used to it. And so I believe that for people who are wanting to progress and develop throughout their career, then imposter syndrome is something, if you want to label it that, that's going to accompany them all the way through. And in a way, we kind of have to learn to appreciate and love it for the evidence that it shows that actually we're developing, we're moving forward.
Yeah, it's trying to stretch yourself. And I think other people appreciating the fact that you might be pushing yourself a little bit further and they're supportive in that can be really helpful in that process.
Yes.
So another question was around Kim Scott's Radical Candor. Are there any other books or reading you would recommend, in addition to your own books, of course?
Yeah, so Kim Scott, Radical Candor, she is an executive at at Facebook. And so she talks, if you, sorry? What's that, Chris?
She was at Google, I believe, and then moved to Facebook, I think.
Yeah, so I think she's done a TED talk. And if you have a look online, Radical Candor, you'll see she's got a talk where she completely, in an unassuming way, talks about the fact that she was having a chat, as you do, with Sheryl Sandberg, the person who founded Lean In. And she just delivered a presentation, Kim. And Sheryl said, well, I want to give you some feedback. And she said, okay, that's great. And she said, you use the word a lot. And Kim said, oh yeah, that's fine, and kind of ignored it. So the message wasn't really getting through. So in the end, what Sheryl Sandberg ended up saying is, you use the word a lot and it makes you look stupid. I'm paraphrasing, but I mean, you can't get much more direct than that. But the point was with Kim was that she says that, she had never had that message before, and she'd given thousands of presentations, and no one had been brave enough to tell her that up until that point. And then she was able to do something about it. And so I think the point with Radical Candor is that, and if you relate it to Choose to Challenge, which is what I do, is that unless you're direct, unless you're specific about what it is that you want to call out, it will just go in one ear and out the other. So you have to be direct, but you also have to do it with compassion, because often the people who are being inappropriate or, saying something that you want to challenge, it's unconscious. They don't realize that what they're doing or what they're saying is inappropriate. And so in a way, you have to meet them where they are first before you can bring them round to where you're thinking.
And intent is so important there, isn't it? To make sure that the intent behind what you're being direct about is positive, and it's not just to pick holes in someone.
That is so true, Chris, because if you have an intent of attacking, really, or making someone feel small, then you're the one who's imposing your power. And so that's misused power. And so your intent is how can we all learn through this? And that can therefore come across in your tone. As you can hear as I'm talking about this, I'm not hard power. I'm quite steady, and my voice is quite gentle, because it's in your tone and the non-verbals which softens the message, but will also enable it to land.
Very good point. And just while we're on how we kind of communicate with one another, there's a really good question here around assertiveness. And it's, as women exhibit assertiveness, they are portrayed as aggressive. How do you challenge that perspective?
Yeah, it's classic, isn't it? It comes up a lot. And what might be perceived as aggressive in a woman when she's communicating, if a man were doing the same thing, people would think it was assertive. And so how do you turn that around? My recommendation when it comes to assertive communication, and it kind of picks up on what we were saying just now, is to pay attention to your words, so the words that you're using, but also pay attention to your non-verbal communication style as well. And if you're keeping it steady and professional and appropriate, and you're using the evidence, then ultimately you'll get your message across. What can sometimes tip over into aggressiveness is if some of the strong language is accompanied by a more of a frustrated tone. And I can understand how sometimes women get so frustrated. But if you combine the words with something that's much stronger like that, it's not always going to land. And I know it's not fair, But ultimately, this is about how do you influence people around to a better way of thinking. And so ultimately, it's how do you tailor your style?
Yeah, the flex, isn't it? And do you think that that has changed now in terms of how you communicate over a virtual platform? You mentioned a lot around body language and non-verbals. Is that something that you changed the way you do that through a virtual medium?
I think when it comes to virtual communication, it's about, and the point around visibility is if you want your message to land and you want to get your voice heard, then you have to show up virtually. And in those situations, you have to give a little notch up, increase the volume, turn the dial up slightly than if you were to do it in the room. Because ultimately, what you're doing is you're competing with all the other distractions that might be in the audience. And so you have to grab people by the hand and be relevant. And so then non-verbally, that shows up in unmuting your camera and unmuting your mic, switching your camera on. Because if you switch everything off, then you almost become invisible. And I'd really want to respect the aspect of neurodiversity and the fact that this is much more comfortable for people who are more on the extroverted end of the spectrum. You're much more comfortable speaking, communicating, being seen, all of that. Not so much can be really quite challenging for people who are more introverted. And so I think at a cultural level, it's important for people to realize that. And I think that the leaders and the organizations, the people who are running the meetings, they need to respect the fact that not everyone is comfortable doing the, camera on, unmuted thing. So to mix up the ways in which people can communicate and maybe occasionally say, let's all just switch our cameras off. Or rather than having another video meeting, why don't we go off and have a walking meeting? So ultimately, to answer your question, Chris, there are a variety of different ways. I think if you want to increase your impact, you have to notch it up a bit and know that you're competing with a whole load of other little tiles on that screen. So you have to compensate for that in some way.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, and I think you mentioning introversion and extroversion there is also another fascinating kind of dynamic within this whole situation. And you mentioned in your talk magnetism, and people knowing to come to you or you going to them and sharing that knowledge that you might have. How might that differ for introverts and extroverts, and how might we try and support those people to power up their potential despite being introverted or extroverted?
Yeah. And this is what I love about magnetism, because the perception could be to be magnetic, you need to be out there, you need to be wearing the brightest clothes and have the loudest voice and tell the most hilarious stories and, be the person who's like, beaming out their light. And of course, that's one way of attracting attention, but that can become too much, right? That can be just overpowering. And when that person starts to eclipse the light of other people, prevent other people from having their voice heard, then that's not fair. That's not equal. But the beauty of magnetism is that often, do you know what? The more introverted people are the people who are the most magnetic, because they are brilliant at asking questions. So they ask questions, they draw people in, they're fascinated by people's answers, they're interested in what they say. And so there's this brilliant story, right, of a coach, like a business coach, he's on a plane going over to America. And he's briefed to only ask questions of the two people on either side, only ask questions, not say anything about themselves at all. They get to JFK and they ask the two people who are on either side of the coach. So tell us about the person you sat next to, what were they like? And they're like, they were the most fascinating person in the world. They were just such great company. Had amazing stories to tell, whereas in actual fact, the coach had said nothing, right? So magnetism is just as much about the questions that you ask, which introverted people tend to be better at, as what you say. But again, it's the balance, because if you spend your whole time asking questions, and I do this a lot being a coach, I spend my whole time asking questions and listening, you can get to the end of the meeting, you'll know everything about them, but they won't know anything about you. So again, it's the balance between how much you speak and how much you listen.
Johari's window, isn't it? Let people in to see you as well, I guess.
Love that. Yeah. And I guess that sort of links to the authenticity part is, you know, people say, oh, be yourself, just be yourself. But that's not the easiest thing in the world. But part of being yourself is finding that meeting of minds where you have a connection and you can communicate at a deeper level.
That's wonderful. I'm just conscious of time, but I'm going to ask one final question because I think it's really important. And there's been a couple of comments on it. And it actually relates to men. And I think this is really important for myself as well. So what suggestions do you have for our male colleagues or male identifying colleagues to support their female colleagues? You know, and how can we change the way we engage with women to help make this important change in the way that the world works?
Yeah, and it's a really important point. And, you know, male allyship is something that's been talked about more and more. But I know that it's not always easy for a man to know how to support their female colleagues. You know, they're desperate to do the right thing and say the right thing, but then feel slightly kind of stuck with what to actually do and say. And I think it's about, how do you encourage everyone around you, right? How do you find ways of pulling everyone up? If you are in a position of authority, or if you're managing women who are within your team, then identify opportunities for them to progress and learn and shine. Remember, bear in mind and be empathetic of those glass bricks that I was telling you about. Unless you have experienced those things yourself, it's really hard to understand what that means. And this applies to all aspects of diversity and inclusion. So to really ramp up that empathy of understanding what it must be like to feel like you need to know 100% about something before you say anything about it. So bring them into the discussion, draw them in, and proactively involve them. And then if you notice examples of subtle mansplaining, and it happens all the time, it really does happen all the time. You might, where a man might take it upon himself to re-explain something that a woman has just articulated perfectly clearly, because maybe it's just a tendency to want to rescue or help. You know, it's not necessarily a patronizing thing. If you notice that happening, then proactively say, well, thank you so much for that input, James. And it's great how it completely reiterated what Jane said just now. So to subtly call it out. So I think that it's to become aware of this and choose to encourage and challenge where appropriate. And also look at making it reciprocal. Another thing you might want to think about is an equal voice ambassador. So where in meetings, you appoint one person to ensure that everyone has an equal voice. To stop that, you know, because sometimes you'll get people who they've got the loudest voice and they talk all the time. You only ever get that perspective. So an equal voice ambassador is quite a useful, valuable, simple technique that everyone can use.
Brilliant. Thank you. I think that was incredibly interesting, not only for myself, but I can see that a number of participants have commented as well. So thank you, Antoinette.
You're welcome. Thank you for
We have run out of time. No problem at all. We've run out of time, and there will be a short survey just at the end as you dial off this call. So please do answer any questions that are asked. Remember, we also have further talks coming up in the month, also celebrating International Women's Day. So we have two further talks, one on the 18th of March, which is building an international career, and one on the 24th of March, which is Perspectives from Female Entrepreneurs. And both of these are delivered by internal speakers this time. So really interesting to get some further perspectives on this subject. Remember that you can find the recording of this call on Greenhouse. So if you want to listen back and make some notes, please do go back onto Greenhouse. And also, if you want to sign up to those other calls, please do so on Greenhouse as well. So you'll know that campus is now Greenhouse. All of the information is on Greenhouse. So Melanie, Antoinette, Lizzie, thank you very much. And we hope you have a great day, everyone.
Happy International Women's Day.
Happy International Women's Day. Thank you so much, Antoinette. Thank you, everyone.
Okay.